So whether we're talking about inherited differences or something caused by a biological harm like exposure to lead, uh, one of the issues is how exactly do those things affect the body and the brain in a way that promotes crime. And so there's a body of literature now on the so-called biological correlates of crime. And we're going to hit kind of the big ones. The brain is a big one. The autonomic nervous system, it's always hard to say, and the issue of biological harms. So the brain has sort of been the biggest area of research connecting biological functions to criminal behavior. Um, and it used to be that we only had indirect measures of the brain, so we'd give people tests and their ability to control impulses, IQ scores, people often think of as a measure of brain health. But over the past 25, 30 years, we've gotten a lot better at directly measuring the brain. And so the area where people are really focusing on now is the prefrontal cortex, and that's the part of the brain that's in the, it's located in the front part of your skull, and it controls the executive function. So a person's ability to think about things, sustain attention, control their impulses, and obviously those are the sorts of things that are going to be related to criminal behavior. Um, and so we have a variety of ways to do that. There's MRI. There's now what's called fMRI, which is a functional MRI. It allows us to sort of give people cognitive tasks while we measure what's going on with their brain. Um, and PET scans are where we, similar to functional MRI, we load up people with sugar solution that has a radioactive dye. And since sugar essentially fuels the brain, we can see what part of the brain kind of lights up. If you've ever seen images from PET scans, it'll be a image of a person's brain with all sorts of different colors, and so that allows us to see what area of the brain is kind of getting lit up and how much is getting lit up for a particular function. So there has been, especially over the last couple decades, a ton of really cool research looking at differences between criminals and non-criminals, or even between different sorts of criminals, between murderers and a control group. Um, if you're interested in that, one of the biggest areas, the biggest dudes doing this is a guy named Adrian Raine. He's a British criminologist, been doing it for a very long time. And he's written a couple popular books. I can't think of them off the top of my head. But it's what I use if you look at the textbook and look at my sites. I use his book a lot as sort of a guide for this sort of research. And it's pretty clear that there are differences in the frontal lobe between criminals and non-criminal control groups. Second area researchers have looked at are neurochemical measures, and especially neurotransmitters. So neurotransmitters are essentially, this is a very simplified version, um, they're essentially the grease that allows the brain cells in the brain to communicate with each other. So communication is sort of electrical impulses, and you think of neurotransmitters as ways to sort of grease and make those electrical impulses easier to fire across the brain. Um, and so there's a ton of research out there suggesting that neurotransmitters, especially serotonin, are linked with impulsivity and aggressive behaviors. Um, I believe it's Prozac, the SSRIs. Um, there's a class of drugs that are designed to sort of change mood, alter mood, um, that essentially work by regulating serotonin. Um, the gene that is implicated in a bunch of studies um, that relates to crime, which we talked about earlier, the Hans Brenner study. Um, the Hans Brenner, what he found was that the MAOA gene, it's a mouthful, that gene was dysfunctional, wasn't working properly in this group of males that he found the very violent behavior in. More generically, there's some research coming out of New Zealand, Terry Moffat's research group that found an interaction between that same gene and violence and crime. And so, again, you can directly measure serotonin. You can look at the genes that control serotonin, and there's emerging evidence that both of those things relate to aggressiveness and impulsivity. The autonomic nervous system essentially controls how the body reacts to stimuli. So When you hear a loud noise, like how much does your heart go up? When you're in a sort of dicey situation, how much do you sweat? How much do you react to the stimuli around you? Um, and so this is sort of research that's fairly simple in some of our earliest biological research, but it still holds true. And so one of the most consistent findings is that offenders tend to have lower resting heart rates than non-offenders. And so you can look at just regular old take somebody's pulse and see what their heart rate is, and then you can say, all right, well, how does their heart jump up? Um, how much does it go up in the presence of some stimuli, some startling stimuli? How fast does it come back down? Um, Skin conductance is essentially a measure of sweat. So we put little electrodes on people's hands and we figure out how much they're sweating. More sweat means that electricity is going to get conducted across the fingers more quickly. Um, they're more mixed than the heart rate studies, but both studies essentially find that criminals tend to react less to stimuli. They have lower levels of what researchers call arousal. And so one of the issues is, well, why would that be? Why would low arousal relate to criminal behavior? And you can think about it in at least a couple ways. One is that if criminals are essentially under aroused, that crime becomes a way to kind of self-medicate. If it's a problem that they're way down low, they essentially need something to kind of bring them up to what other people experience as normal. The other way to think about it is that if crime is sort of risky and requires a certain personality type, that somebody with uh, low reaction, low arousal would be better at performing those sorts of tasks. Now, obviously, the same sort of thing is probably going to relate to somebody's odds of being, I don't know, a rock climber or somebody who defuses bombs or somebody who bungee jumps. People enjoy roller coasters versus people who don't, but it also might relate to criminal behavior. Um, all right, the third way in which biology has been linked to crime and the research is what are called biological harms. So aside from any sort of genetic issue, um, this is talking about kind of exposure to something in the environment that changes your biology. Um, and some of the earliest research is what are called perinatal risks. So perinatal means at or around the time that a pregnant person gives birth. And so there's research on things that pregnant mothers can do that harm the fetus. And so smoking and alcohol consumption are two of the biggest areas. And so here's the issue. If the mom drinks a bunch of alcohol, it has an effect on the fetus that is very predictable. It's called fetal alcohol syndrome. Fetal alcohol babies take on a very distinct appearance, and they have a cluster of behavioral problems that's very well known, including inability to sustain attention and control impulses and all those sorts of things. One of the interesting research questions is, well, what if it's alcohol consumption short of what would produce a FAS baby? Um, or what are something else, smoking cigarettes, mild drug use, something like that? Um, does it shape the fetus in ways that will still produce problems but may not be as obvious? And so there's a bunch of research connecting all the stuff that you see up here: smoking cigarettes, alcohol consumption. Delivery complications would be things like emergency C-sections, having to use a forceps, baby losing oxygen. And in these studies, most of it's like a scale, like how many things went wrong. And the more things that go wrong, the more able you link that to behavior later in life. Um, and so one of the sort of things, again, kind of an interesting thing that ties this research together is that a lot of this stuff doesn't produce direct effects. So having a low birth weight kid in and of itself may not relate to um, deviance or criminal behavior. It's the combination of low birth weight in the context of a very unstable family or sort of low skilled parents or living in a really troubled neighborhood. It's the combination of the biological effect and the environmental effect that relates to later crime. So one of the examples, for example, one of the studies, for example, is they looked at moms smoking cigarettes, and there's an interaction where if mom smoked a lot of cigarettes and it was a sort of troubled household, that's what produced crime later in life. But if it was just smoking, just the household, it didn't get as big of an effect. Low birth weight is interesting in the sense that, you know, is it the birth weight or is it that moms who have low birth weight children um, tend not to be the best moms? So, you have a low birth weight child sometimes by randomness, but sometimes that alcohol use and other sort of risky behaviors produce low birth weight kids. There's a great study uh, looking at low birth weight that was produced by war. So, World War II, the Germans cut off a supply line, and essentially half of a country had very low birth weight kids because the mothers were starving. So, low birth weight wasn't produced by the behaviors of the mom or choices made by the mom. It was produced by an act of war. And what they found is that there was still a connection between low birth weight children and a conviction for adult offenses when these kids grew up to be 18 years old. So, again, very sort of interesting area of research. Um, there are a whole host of environmental toxins related to crime. The biggest by far is that's been documented is lead exposure. So lead is extraordinarily toxic, especially for young children. And it's true for young children because when you're younger, when you're 2, 3, 4 years of age, your brain is expanding very rapidly, and lead screws up that part of your brain. And so if it's at a time when your brain is expanding rapidly, it's going to have exponentially more damage. Um, and so people get exposed to lead primarily from lead paint, and it used to be leaded gasoline. Um, More recently, as the Flint, Michigan story makes clear that older cities have a lot of lead water lines as well, and so lead pipes might leach lead into the water system. I think the biggest tragedy of the Flint story is that for the most part the lead doesn't really leach out of the pipes unless it gets corroded, and so my understanding of what happened is that when they switched water sources and drew from the Flint River, that the Flint River was much more acidic and essentially ate away at the pipes in a way that loosed all this lead into the system. And it sounds like had they added an agent to the water that would reduce that acidity, that nothing would have happened, that the lead would not have leached out. Um, So we had leaded gasoline in cars up until the 1970s. Lead paint was produced. And by the way, one of the other interesting stories is that, yes, there was a lead lobby back in the 50s and 60s that was fighting all this research showing that lead was toxic and that we should control lead, that was saying, we don't really know. Research is unclear. We shouldn't get rid of lead paint just yet. And so Sherwin-Williams and other paint companies that use lead, folks that supported leaded gasoline, had a lobby that sort of fought this legislation all the way. But we did sort of ban lead paint, lead gasoline. You still get leaded gasoline if you live next to interstate highway. There's residue. Lead paint is still in old houses, and if it flakes off, people can ingest it. Um, so lead has been linked to delinquent behavior. Where I came from, University of Cincinnati has one of the biggest ongoing lead studies. There's a medical school there and obviously big criminology program, and so they've worked together. And so I know people that have done this research, and it's startling how strongly lead is related to delinquent behavior. It's one of the strongest predictors. So they have measures of you measure the lead density in somebody's bone. So the more lead you absorb, the more it gets into your actual bones. And so you can take these special X-rays that detect lead, and lead density is in their database one of the best predictors of crime. So we know more about it, and it's one of the things that's sort of really tragic about Flint is that we know that, especially for young kids, it's a pretty harmful substance. All right, so I want to give you some sense of kind of what do we know about biology that's related to crime. The other issue is sort of how we connected the dots. So um, there's some evidence that there's a genetic relationship with crime. There's a lot of evidence that physical characteristics of people do relate to offending. And so the next step is, well, what's the theory to sort of link that with criminal behavior? What's the story we can tell? And I'm going to give you sort of three examples. One is life course persistent theory of offending, which we'll talk about later. Um, And so the LCP, the basic theory is that Moffat makes the argument that there's sort of two kinds of offenders in the world. That adolescent limited offenders are essentially adolescents that are, experimenting with deviance, that most of us do some underage drinking, some vandalism, and experiment with drugs and those sorts of things. Um, but that there's a very small percent, like 5% of any cohort, that causes most of the damage for that cohort. So you have these chronic offenders that are deviant. They're the second grader that's acting like way age inappropriately and pushing other kids and always getting in trouble. And as they age, they get involved in serious crime and they continue crime later in life. And so one of our questions is, well, why is this so stable? Why is it so chronic over time? And so one of our hypotheses is that part of the reason it's stable is because it's caused by some neurological deficit. And the deficit might be genetic, it might be caused by biological harm, but our argument is that often they're subtle, but they're neurological deficits that affect the frontal lobe of the brain. And so in her theory, she talks about how you can have these kids, they're going to be difficult to parent, they're not going to learn as well, they're going to have a hard time controlling their impulses. And this is the biosocial part, the interaction between biology and the environment, that when these are very difficult kids to take care of, even for the best equipped parents that have a bunch of resources. When you put it in the context of ineffective parents, maybe who are struggling just to kind of survive, that you get this sort of explosion where the parents can't control the kid and the kid does whatever they want, and it sort of snowballs and mushrooms from there. And so this is a great example of a theory that incorporates biology in a sort of more nuanced way than the old theories we have. Another example, and this is an older theory, Hans Einstein basically made the argument way back in the 60s and 70s that personality traits, which we'll talk about next capsule, are sort of the observable feature of the biology that underlies them. And so he believes that the sort of main personality traits we have are due to biological differences. And in particular, he sort of played around with that low arousal thing that we talked about earlier, and came up with a very interesting hypothesis. So arousal might be related sort of more directly, right? We talked about how if a person is more comfortable with a risky situation, somebody who finds roller coasters exciting and not scary, they're going to be a little bit more equipped to engage in crime. They're going to be more comfortable with the risk that it takes to engage in a lot of crime. But it may be that arousal relates sort of more indirectly and earlier in the life course. And one of the interesting things is, this is one Hans pointed out a long time ago, is that perhaps it has to do with how we socialize kids, right? And so most psychologists would say that what we think of as a conscience is actually a conditioned effect, that kid does something wrong, parents punish them, kid feels horrible, and this happens over and over again. Eventually the kid, when you contemplate doing something you know is wrong, you feel anxious, your palms sweat, you feel bad. But what would happen if a kid, when they got punished, didn't really feel the sting of punishment? And so if low arousal means you don't react to stimuli, parents punishing you is a environmental stimuli. Most kids react by crying, by feeling bad. What happens if the kid doesn't feel that sort of sting of punishment? Um, Einstein would say they'd be harder to train. That they'd be harder to kind of train this kid one way or the other, because the major tool you're using is punishing bad behavior. And so um, I chuckle because I have a brother that's kind of like that he never felt a vivid memory of my mom just wailing, spanking him. I don't know what he did wrong, but the whole time she was spanking him, he was kind of chuckling and laughing. And like me, I'm the more pointy-headed, neurotic kid. I was like, whoa, I'd be bawling if I was him. So that's another kind of way to incorporate biology, to talk about how, well, a major sort of environmental effect that parenting and socializing and shaping a kid might depend a little bit on at least the biology of that kid and how they respond to punishment. The last one is kind of a more very simple, but also kind of great example of a biosocial sort of interaction. We've known for a very long time that the onset of puberty for females is linked to their criminal behavior. So girls whose puberty starts earlier in life, so when do they get their first period? Girls that get their first period when they are 10, 11, 12 are more likely to engage in crime than girls who develop a little bit later. And there's just kind of, prior to this study, there was just kind of speculation about why that might be true. And this is a great study looking at, trying to test different theories. And what they found, they had this great sample of some of the girls that were in a co-ed regular public high school and some of the girls that were in a all-girl school. And what they found was that the early onset of puberty only mattered for the kids that were in the co-ed school. And why would that be? And the conclusion was, well, if you think about what changes for girls who develop early, well, their body changes in ways that they tend to attract the attention of older kids, and especially older boys. So if you think about a 12-year-old girl who develops early starts to attract the attention of 15, 16-year-old boys, and 15, 16-year-old boys are sort of in the prime age range of deviance and crime. And so it's a great example of pretty simple interaction between biology and environment. The start of puberty is a pretty clear-cut biological process, but it matters in the context of a particular environment. So it matters when girls are exposed to sort of older crime-prone males, which then leads to delinquency. Evolutionary theory, I think we're going to skip, because I don't think there's anything on the quiz about that. So in sum, biological factors do appear to be related to criminal behavior. Kind of how you look at the evidence tends to depend on what background you have. Psychologists tend to be a lot more open to this and see this. Psychologists tend to look at the evidence and go, duh, it's pretty obvious, whereas sociologists tend to still remain skeptical about relationships. They tend to try to fight it and say, well, there's a problem with this study or a problem with that study. I think the evidence, especially as we're able to directly study the genome and sort of be more sophisticated with our brain imaging, has gotten a lot better. So there does appear to be a lot going on with biology and crime. The other thing is that our biosocial theories are starting to get a little bit better. They're still sort of in their infancy, though. But the key is that the theories we have about biology are not like you inherit some big thing that directly causes you to get crime. It tends to be a lot more subtle. That genetics and biology and the body are sort of important in the context of everything that's happening in the environment. And so it's the mix of those two things that relate to crime. Obviously, as with other theories, there's criticisms. Almost all of the research on biology and crime is on street crime. And so that ignores white collar, organized crime, political crime. We're going to talk about these sorts of criminal acts later. But if you think about something like the research that links brain and the ability to control impulse, you think about it in the context of white collar crime, it doesn't make as much sense, right? Because most white collar offenders have done pretty well in school. They've moved up organizationally and put themselves in a position to engage in white collar crime. Suspect their brain functions in a particular way. So biological theories are limited in the sense that they tend to focus almost exclusively on street crime rather than other forms of crime. In terms of policy implications, there's a lot of folks out there that still fear the ethics of biological theories. And so they worry about what people will do with science that links biology and crime, and whether minorities and other folks are going to be targeted as sort of inferior people. So one of the ethical issues is what would happen if we discovered that a particular gene was strongly related to crime, and we had a way to alter that gene. Would we subject people who engage in crime to gene therapy, where we say we're going to alter your genetics in a way that's going to make you less likely to engage in crime? So people worry, especially sociologists, but also, people in this field, more biologically oriented chronologists worry about how the public will consume this research and what will happen. Um, I think it is a sort of valid concern. I think, you know, history provides a lot of examples where we sort of overreact. Um, the upside, I guess, the other way of looking at this is that it's part of an overall trend to see crime as a sort of public health problem. And so, if there's a ton of research, for example, on prenatal, perinatal problems that relate to crime, um, one of the sort of non-controversial policy implications would be to provide better prenatal care. Find at-risk mothers, um, give them prenatal vitamins, give them better health care, prevent the sort of risky pregnancies that can be counterproductive. Um, and the other, I mean, think of like Flint and like the other stuff is that if there's toxins in the environment that relate to crime, again, it's another sort of non-controversial public health sort of policy is to get those toxins out and figure out ways to reduce the risk associated with those toxins. So there are sort of non-controversial or less controversial policies that flow from the research on biology and crime.